12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic, a species of bacteria discovered in 2010 and named after the ship it was found devouring, has been converting the Titanic's steel hull into rust for more than a century. No one has been able to say with precision how much longer the wreck will keep its recognizable shape, because the organism responsible for that conversion doesn't act evenly, and it doesn't stop. Photographs taken across nearly 4 decades of expeditions, from the wreck's rediscovery in 1985 through dives conducted in 2022, show entire sections of the ship simply gone between visits. Not damaged, gone. This isn't a slow, uniform fade either. Some areas have collapsed within a span of years, while others, made of nearly identical steel, remain almost untouched. Over the next several minutes, we'll walk through what researchers have actually documented at the site, point by point, building toward a detail about this decay that contradicts almost everything people assume about how shipwrecks age. Here's what we actually know. In 2010, a research team working out of Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in collaboration with colleagues at the University of Seville in Spain, isolated a previously uncatalogued bacterium from a sample taken directly off the Titanic's hull. They named it Halomonas titanicae. It wasn't discovered because someone went looking for a new species. It was discovered because researchers wanted to understand exactly what was eating the ship. And the answer turned out to be an organism science hadn't formally described until that point. The material Halomonas titanicae lives in and helps produce is called a rusticle, a term coined by the team that first surveyed the wreck in the 1980s to describe the icicle-like formations of rust hanging off the hull in the tens of thousands. A rusticle isn't just corroded metal. It's a porous, actively growing structure, closer in behavior to a coral colony than to ordinary rust, with channels running through it that let water and nutrients circulate to the bacteria living inside. Some rusticles recovered from the site have been measured at several feet in length. Structurally, they're fragile enough to crumble at a touch, yet they've been persistently forming and reforming on the wreck for well over a century. What the data doesn't explain is why colonization is so wildly uneven across a ship built from what was, at the time, a fairly consistent grade of steel. Some plating has been reduced to lace-thin sheets that a submersible's light can pass through. Other plating, just a few dozen feet away, remains thick enough that researchers have described it as barely touched. The leading hypothesis involves differences in local oxygen exposure, water flow, and microscopic variations in the metal's original composition, but no single explanation has been confirmed as the primary driver. That inconsistency is one of the reasons predicting the wreck's future has proven so difficult. Robert Ballard's team located the wreck in 1985, roughly 73 years after the sinking, split into 2 main sections nearly a third of a mile apart on the seafloor. At that point, despite decades underwater, the bow section still read almost like a photograph of the ship itself. Railings intact, deck fittings recognizable, the silhouette unmistakably the Titanic. That baseline, captured on film during those first dips, is what every subsequent expedition has effectively been measured against. Without it, researchers wouldn't have a fixed reference point for how much has actually changed. Here's a claim worth sitting with, because it tends to divide people. Some marine archaeologists argue that the manned and unmanned expeditions returning to the site again and again, however well-intentioned, have measurably accelerated its collapse through submersible contact, disturbed sediment, and artificial light exposure. Others insist the site was always going to deteriorate at roughly this pace regardless of visitors, and that documentation is worth the marginal risk. Both positions are argued by credentialed researchers, and the disagreement hasn't been settled by data either way. Whether repeated human visitation is preserving the Titanic story or quietly hastening the loss of the object itself is a genuinely open argument. And it's one worth having in the comments. That's where the documented trail gets more concrete. Follow-up dives using manned submersibles through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, including extensive filming conducted around 2001, produced detailed footage that, when combined frame by frame with the 1985 material, already showed measurable thinning along exposed railings and deck edges. This wasn't dramatic collapse yet. It was steady, incremental loss, the kind that's easy to miss dive to dive, and only becomes obvious once you stack the years together. That's where the incremental story became something else entirely. In 2019, the first crewed expedition to the wreck in 14 years documented what the team publicly described as shocking deterioration. The most cited example was the disappearance of the captain's bathtub, a fixture that had survived in recognizable form through decades of previous dives and had become something of a landmark for divers and documentarians. By 2019, that section of the officers' quarters had partially collapsed, and the tub itself could no longer be located in its previous position. The starboard side of the officers' promenade had deteriorated to the point that researchers described the deck structure there as actively giving way. If the idea of a bacterium slowly reshaping one of the most documented objects in maritime history is the kind of place-based anomaly you find worth tracking, this channel builds entire episodes around exactly this pattern. A specific site, a specific measurable process, and the gap between what's proven and what still isn't. That's the kind of thing subscribing tends to be useful for, if this is the sort of question that holds your attention past the headline. The bow railing tells a similar story from a different angle. That railing, one of the most photographed and filmed sections of the wreck because of its visibility and its association with popular depictions of the ship, has shown clear, progressive loss across expeditions from the 1990s onward. By the 20-teens, sections had visibly buckled and, in places, detached entirely from the deck they were once bolted to. Officially, the explanation is straightforward metal fatigue combined with biological consumption. The complication is that the rate of that loss hasn't been consistent year to year, which makes extrapolating a firm timeline from any single comparison misleading. In 2022, a mapping expedition using submersibles and sonar produced what's been described as a full-scale digital reconstruction of the entire wreck site, generated from more than 700,000 images stitched into a single model. This wasn't just another set of photographs for comparison. For the first time, researchers had a precise three-dimensional baseline against which every future expedition could measure change with far more accuracy than photograph-to-photograph comparison ever allowed. Early analysis using that model has already identified structural stress points that weren't clearly visible in previous surveys. Here's the detail that doesn't fit the simple decay narrative most people assume. While the exposed steel hull is disappearing, sections of the debris field between the bow and stern have preserved organic materials, leather goods in particular, in far better condition than anyone modeling ocean floor decomposition would have predicted, because the same bacterial and chemical processes consuming the iron appear to have created localized conditions that inhibit the organisms that would otherwise break down leather and similar materials. In other words, the very decay eating the ship's structure may be simultaneously preserving fragments of what the ship once carried. Researchers have not fully explained the mechanism behind this contrast, and it remains one of the more counterintuitive findings from the wreck site. That contradiction sits at the center of the entire story. The same forces erasing the Titanic as a structure are, in isolated pockets, protecting pieces of it as objects. No one disputes that the hull is disappearing. It's the shape that disappearance will ultimately take, a gradual, decades-long crumbling, or a sudden structural failure once specific support points give way, that researchers openly disagree on, and there's no consensus estimate that's held up for long before being revised. So where does that leave the timeline people actually want? The one from the title. Estimates offered publicly by researchers involved in recent expeditions have ranged from a few decades to considerably longer before the wreck stops being recognizable as a ship at all, with some figures placing significant structural loss within the next several decades. These are projections, openly labeled as such by the people making them, not fixed dates. The uneven colonization pattern discussed earlier is exactly why. A model that assumes constant decay across constant material doesn't hold up against a site where identical steel corrodes at wildly different rates just feet apart. Anyone offering you an exact year the Titanic will be gone is offering more confidence than the data currently supports. Go back to that first image. The ship photographed in 1985, railings intact, silhouette whole, sitting in darkness where it had rested undisturbed for 73 years. What's changed since is documented dive by dive, in a way few underwater sites in history have been. The bathtub is gone. The railing is failing. The bacterium has a name and a genome sequence, and a full digital model now exists to measure whatever happens next. What hasn't changed is the honest gap at the center of it. Researchers can describe the process in detail and still can't tell you, with any confidence, exactly how it ends. Whether the Titanic's final disappearance will be a slow erasure stretched across generations or a single collapse compressed into a matter of days is a question the data hasn't answered yet, and it may not be answerable until it's already happened.